At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th of January, 1942, Sergeant Jose Calugas was washing rice pots next to his field kitchen, positioned near Culis in Bataan province. That's when the Battery B 75mm gun emplacement, located 1,000 yards to the north, suddenly went quiet during a Japanese artillery barrage. Calugas was 34 years of age and had served 12 years with the Philippine Scouts. However, his role was that of a mess sergeant, not an artilleryman. The Scouts had already lost 11 artillery crews over the preceding 9 days. Each gun position that fell silent remained that way. The Battle of Bataan had started 10 days prior, when American and Filipino forces finished their retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. 80,000 troops, along with 26,000 civilians, now found themselves trapped on a jungle peninsula measuring 60 miles in length and 20 miles across. The Japanese 14th Army had control of everything lying north of Bataan. General Masaharu Homma had given orders for his forces to capture Bataan within 50 days. His artillery and air power had been hammering American positions continuously since the 7th of January. Calugas had enlisted with the Philippine Scouts back in 1930 when he was 23. He went through basic training at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, followed by artillery school. The Scouts then assigned him to the 24th Field Artillery Regiment, stationed at Fort Stotzenberg in the Philippines. He got married and began raising a family. By 1941, he had transferred over to the 88th Field Artillery Regiment in the capacity of mess sergeant. His responsibility was providing meals for soldiers, not engaging in combat. The Philippine Scouts represented the elite Filipino units within the United States Army. Their service dated back to 1901. They were professional soldiers with American officers commanding Filipino enlisted personnel. But Bataan was destroying them systematically. By the middle of January, Scout artillery batteries were functioning at half their normal strength. The Japanese had achieved air superiority. Every single gun position had been mapped out. Crews were dying more quickly than replacements could be brought in. Still, the Scouts continued firing. On the morning of January 16th, Calugas had prepared lunch for the Battery B gun crews: rice, some canned salmon, whatever supplies still remained. The Scouts were already down to half rations. No resupply convoy was on its way. Everyone understood this reality. After the lunch service, Calugas and his mess crew began cleaning their equipment near the kitchen position. The 88th Field Artillery guns were emplaced in the woods 1,000 yards to the north. The crews had been firing throughout the morning at a Japanese infantry column that was advancing toward the American defensive line. Then the Japanese artillery located them. Calugas could hear the enemy shells striking the gun position. Explosions echoed through the air, followed by silence. No return fire came. He waited, listening carefully. Still nothing. The Japanese column would be reaching the American infantry within minutes if they didn't have artillery support. Calugas understood what a silenced gun meant. Either a dead crew, destroyed equipment, or both. The Japanese were applying heavy pressure. They needed to achieve a breakthrough before American reinforcements could arrive. Every gun that stopped firing made their task easier. Did Calugas's decision end up saving the line? Please give this video a like. It helps share these stories. And subscribe. Back to Bataan. Calugas gathered 16 volunteers from his mess crew and nearby positions. They would need to cross 1,000 yards of open ground to reach that gun. Rice paddies stretched out before them, with no cover available. Japanese aircraft were conducting strafing runs over the area. Their artillery continued firing. Every single man understood the odds they faced. Most crews who got caught in the open ended up dying before they could reach safety. But that gun had to be brought back into action. The Japanese column continued its advance. American infantry sat waiting for artillery support that had stopped arriving. The volunteers began their run. Japanese fighters spotted them right away. Machine gun fire ripped across the rice paddies. Artillery shells started falling around them. Men began going down. Some stopped in their tracks and turned back. Calugas kept running forward. A few stayed with him. The distance gradually closed. 900 yards, 800, 700. The Japanese artillery fire intensified. They knew Americans were moving toward the gun position. More volunteers fell. Calugas ran harder still. He reached the gun position, completely alone. The other volunteers were gone, dead, wounded, or driven back. The 75mm gun sat in a bomb crater beside its emplacement. The crew lay scattered around the position, some dead, some wounded. One gunner remained alive, and Calugas, a cook, was now the only man standing who possessed the ability to fire the weapon. The Japanese column was 300 yards away, and closing rapidly. Calugas dropped down into the crater. The 75mm gun had been knocked sideways by the bomb blast. The breech mechanism remained intact. The barrel appeared straight. The recoil system showed no visible damage, but the gun sat at the wrong angle, rendering it useless. He needed to get it upright and back into the emplacement. One man couldn't move a 1,500-pound artillery piece. He needed assistance. The wounded gunner was conscious. A private from the regular crew, hit in the shoulder, but still mobile. Calugas located 2 more gunners from adjacent positions. They had watched him running across the paddies and followed him in. 4 men total, enough to move the gun if they worked quickly. The Japanese artillery kept falling. Shells hit 50 yards away, then 40 yards. The enemy had observers watching this position. They knew Americans were present here. Calugas had trained on these guns at Fort Sill back in 1930. 12 years ago now, but artillery crews drilled the same procedures until they became automatic responses. He knew every single step. The men grabbed hold of the gun trails and lifted. The gun moved 6 inches. They set it down, adjusted their grip, then lifted again. Another 6 inches. Japanese machine gun fire raked across the position from the north. The column was closer now, 250 yards, and still advancing. They got the gun upright. Calugas directed them to roll it back onto the firing platform. The private with the shoulder wound operated the trail spade, while the other 2 gunners manhandled the carriage. Calugas checked the elevation wheel and the traversing mechanism. Both were functional. He opened the breech. Clear. The ammunition stores had escaped being hit. Armor-piercing rounds, high explosive rounds, everything they needed was still there. Calugas loaded an armor-piercing round. The Japanese column was crossing a wooden footbridge over a creek 200 yards north. Infantry, trucks, horse-drawn artillery caissons. They were bunched up at the bridge crossing. A perfect target. He aimed carefully. The wounded private steadied the trail. Calugas fired. The round hit the bridge dead center. Wood exploded outward. The lead truck tilted sideways into the creek. Japanese soldiers scattered in all directions. He loaded again. High explosive this time. Aimed at the vehicles stacked up behind the destroyed bridge. Fired. The shell detonated among 3 trucks. Ammunition, aboard 1 vehicle, cooked off. Secondary explosions ripped through the column. The Japanese advance stopped cold. Troops dove for cover. Their officers were shouting orders that Calugas couldn't hear, but he could see the result clearly. The column was trapped, bridge destroyed, vehicles burning, no way forward. Calugas kept firing continuously. The other gunners loaded rounds and adjusted the trail as he called out corrections. High explosive into the infantry concentrations. Armor piercing into the remaining vehicles. The Japanese tried to ford the creek. He dropped shells into the water. Men went down in the explosions. The column started pulling back. Away from the bridge, away from the creek, away from the American line they had been pushing toward. The Japanese artillery shifted its fire. Shells began landing directly on Calugas's position. The enemy observers had pinpointed his gun. Every Japanese battery within range was now targeting the single 75mm piece that had halted their advance. The bombardment intensified dramatically. Shells hit 30 yards out, 20 yards, 15. Calugas and his improvised crew kept firing, but the odds had just changed significantly. The Japanese were not going to allow this gun to keep shooting. They were going to destroy it. Calugas had fired 18 rounds in 12 minutes. He had stopped the Japanese column, killed dozens of soldiers, destroyed multiple vehicles. But now every enemy gun within 3 miles was aimed directly at his position. The next salvo was already in the air. He had seconds to decide, stay and die, or move the gun and survive to fight again. The American infantry line was still waiting for artillery support. The Japanese would attack again the moment this gun went silent. Calugas made the decision in 3 seconds. He would not abandon the gun, but he would not stay in the crater either. The woods were 30 yards west, dense jungle. The Japanese observers couldn't see through that canopy. He could fire from the crater, then move the gun into the trees before the counterfire arrived. Shoot and move, hide and shoot again. The Japanese would waste shells on empty positions while he kept hitting their column. He and the 3 gunners manhandled the gun out of the crater, rolled it across open ground to the tree line. Japanese shells landed where they had been standing 10 seconds earlier. Dirt and shrapnel flew everywhere. The men dove into the jungle and waited. The bombardment continued for 2 minutes. 40 rounds at least, all hitting the abandoned crater. When the firing stopped, Calugas moved the gun back to the crater's edge, loaded, aimed at the Japanese column regrouping north of the destroyed bridge. He fired 3 rounds of high explosive. The shells landed among the troops trying to reorganize. Then he and the crew hauled the gun back into the woods. 20 seconds later, Japanese artillery saturated the crater again. The enemy was firing blind now. They knew the general area but couldn't pinpoint the gun. Calugas had turned their own artillery doctrine against them. Observers called in corrections, batteries fired. But by the time the shells landed, the American gun was gone. For the next 6 hours, Calugas repeated the pattern. Move gun to firing position. Fire 3 to 5 rounds. Move gun back into jungle. Wait for Japanese counter-battery fire. Move gun to new position. Fire again. The Japanese artillery crews grew increasingly frustrated. They fired hundreds of rounds, trying to silence one American gun. They hit nothing but empty ground and trees. Meanwhile, Calugas kept destroying their vehicles and killing their troops. By 1600 hours, Calugas had fired 47 rounds. The Japanese column had completely halted its advance. Dead and wounded littered the area north of the creek. Burning vehicles blocked the road. The enemy infantry had dug in defensive positions. They were not moving forward anymore. The American defensive line held. Other 88th Field Artillery batteries had withdrawn to new positions during the fighting, but this one gun, operated by a mess sergeant and 3 volunteers, had given them time to displace without Japanese pressure. The ammunition supply was running low. Calugas counted the remaining rounds: 13 armor-piercing, 8 high-explosive, 21 total. Enough for maybe 4 more fire missions. The sun was setting. The Japanese artillery had slowed down. Their observers couldn't see in the fading light. This would be his last chance to inflict damage before darkness stopped the fighting. He positioned the gun at the crater edge one more time. Calugas aimed at the Japanese positions north of the creek. They had established a command post near a large tree. He could see officers moving around it, radio antennas, map tables. He loaded armor-piercing and fired. The round went high, exploded in the tree canopy. He adjusted elevation and fired again. Direct hit. The command post disappeared in the explosion. Japanese soldiers scattered. Their communications were disrupted, their coordination broken. He fired the remaining 19 rounds over 30 minutes. Methodical, precise, each shell placed exactly where it would cause maximum disruption. When the last round was gone, Calugas surveyed the battlefield. The Japanese advance had been stopped. The American line held firm. The 88th Field Artillery had successfully withdrawn. His mission was complete. But he still had 2 problems. The gun needed to be evacuated before the Japanese attacked at dawn, and his field kitchen was still sitting 1,000 yards south with all his equipment. Calugas found 2 trucks from a retreating supply column. The drivers had been ordered to abandon anything that couldn't move fast. He explained the situation, showed them the gun, told them about the kitchen. The drivers agreed to help. They would take the gun first, then the kitchen. Both had to be evacuated before sunrise, or the Japanese would capture them. Calugas and the 3 gunners loaded the 75mm onto the first truck. But moving the gun had created a new problem. The Japanese now knew it was being evacuated. Their artillery opened fire again, and this time the trucks were visible targets. The first truck carrying the 75mm gun pulled away from the tree line at 18:30 hours. Japanese artillery shells began landing immediately. The enemy had maintained observation on the area despite the darkness. They knew something was moving. The driver accelerated hard. Calugas and the 3 gunners rode on the truck bed, steadying the gun as the vehicle bounced over the rough road. Shells hit 50 yards behind them, then 40 yards. The Japanese were walking their fire along the road. The truck reached the 88th field, artillery's new position, 3 miles south at 1900 hours. The gun was intact. The crew was alive. Calugas reported to the battery commander and explained what had happened. The commander listened without saying anything, then sent Calugas back north for the kitchen equipment. The second truck was waiting where they had left it. The Japanese were still shelling the area, but less intensely now. Darkness had reduced their accuracy. Calugas and 2 volunteers loaded the field kitchen onto the truck. Pots, pans, rice bags, canned goods, everything that could be salvaged. The mess sergeant's job didn't stop because he had spent the afternoon firing artillery. Men still needed to eat. The truck made the return trip without incident. The Japanese had shifted their artillery to other targets. By 2100 hours, Calugas was back with Battery B. He set up the kitchen, cooked beans and rice, served the meal to the gun crews who had been fighting all day. Then he cleaned the equipment and prepared for the next morning. The battery commander filed the report that night and sent it up the chain of command. By January 18th, the report had reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters on Corregidor Island. MacArthur read it personally. A mess sergeant had run 1,000 yards under fire without orders, operated a gun alone for 6 hours, stopped a Japanese advance, evacuated the weapon, and returned to cooking duties. MacArthur had seen many acts of courage in 40 years of military service. This one stood out. He recommended Calugas for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork moved fast by military standards. The War Department approved the recommendation on February 24, 1942. General Order No. 10 announced the award. Sergeant Jose Calugas would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on January 16th. He was the first Filipino-American to earn the medal in World War II. But there was a problem. Calugas couldn't receive the medal yet. The fighting on Bataan was getting worse, much worse. By late January, the American and Filipino forces were running out of everything. Food, medicine, ammunition. The half rations became quarter rations, then 1/8 rations. Disease spread through the units. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Men could barely walk, but they kept fighting. The Japanese had been reinforced. Fresh divisions, new artillery, more aircraft. General Homer was under pressure from Tokyo. Bataan should have fallen by mid-February. It was now late February, and the Americans still held the peninsula. Calugas continued serving as mess sergeant for Battery B. He cooked whatever food remained. Rice, occasionally fish, sometimes just broth made from grass and bark. The gun crews needed calories to operate the weapons, but the food supply was nearly gone. The scouts were eating their horses, their pack mules, anything to stay alive. The Japanese knew the Americans were starving. They just had to wait. Time was on their side. In early March, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. The general didn't want to leave, but orders were orders. He departed Corregidor on March 11th, leaving General Jonathan Wainwright in command of all forces in the Philippines. Wainwright knew the truth. No reinforcements were coming, no resupply, no rescue. The Philippines had been written off. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore, then they would surrender. It was only a question of when. By early April, the Japanese launched their final offensive. Fresh troops, heavy artillery, constant air attacks. The American and Filipino lines began collapsing. Units retreated, reformed, retreated again. The Scouts fought harder than anyone, but they were starving, sick, exhausted. On April 8th, Major General Edward King, commander of forces on Bataan, made the decision. He would surrender. Approximately 76,000 American and Filipino troops would become prisoners of war. It was the largest surrender in American military history. And Jose Calugas, Medal of Honor recipient, was about to become a prisoner of the Japanese army. The surrender came at noon on April 9th, 1942. General King sent officers under a white flag to meet Japanese commanders. The terms were simple: unconditional surrender. All troops would lay down their weapons immediately. All equipment would be turned over intact. The Japanese would provide food and medical care for prisoners. That last promise was a lie. What followed was one of the worst atrocities in modern warfare. Calugas was with Battery B when the order came. The Scouts were told to destroy their guns before surrendering. The men used sledgehammers on the breech mechanisms, poured sand into the barrels, made the weapons useless. Then they waited for the Japanese to arrive. Calugas had one problem the other soldiers didn't have. He was a Medal of Honor recipient. The Japanese High Command knew about the medal. They monitored American communications. If they discovered Calugas had earned the award, they would execute him immediately or subject him to special torture. He needed to hide any evidence. The general order announcing his Medal of Honor was a piece of paper in his field pack. Calugas found a shovel, dug a hole, buried the order deep in the ground near a tree he hoped to remember. Then he told every scout in Battery B to forget about the medal. Never mention it. If the Japanese asked questions, he was just a cook. Nothing more. The men agreed. They understood what would happen if the secret came out. The march began on April 10th. The Japanese called it a transfer to prisoner of war camps. The Americans and Filipinos would walk from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell, near Capas in Tarlac Province, 65 miles. The Japanese said it would take 4 days. They provided no food, no water, no medical supplies. Men who couldn't walk would be left behind. That was the official policy. The reality was worse. Men who fell were beaten, shot, beheaded. The Japanese soldiers treated prisoners like animals, sometimes worse than animals. Calugas started walking with 76,000 other prisoners. Filipinos and Americans mixed together. The first day was bearable. Men were weak from months of starvation, but most could still move. The second day was harder. The tropical heat was brutal. No shade, no water. Men began collapsing. The Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who stopped, left the bodies on the road. Other prisoners had to step over the corpses and keep walking. Anyone who tried to help the fallen was beaten or killed. On the third day, Calugas contracted malaria. Fever, chills, delirium. Many men with malaria died during the march. The disease combined with dehydration and starvation was lethal. But Calugas realized the fever gave him an advantage. The Japanese guards avoided sick prisoners. They didn't want to catch diseases. If Calugas looked sick enough, they might leave him alone. He exaggerated the symptoms, shook harder than necessary, wrapped himself in burlap sacks he found along the road, trembled visibly whenever guards inspected the column. The strategy worked. Guards saw him shaking, assumed he was dying, moved on to harass other prisoners. Calugas kept walking. The malaria was real. The performance made it look worse. He stayed in the middle of the column, never at the front where strong prisoners were, never at the back where weak prisoners were executed. Middle was safest, anonymous, invisible, just another sick Filipino soldier in a river of 76,000 dying men. By the fourth day, the death toll was catastrophic. Bodies lined the road every few hundred yards. The tropical sun accelerated decomposition. The smell was overwhelming. Men who had survived 4 months of combat on Bataan were dying on a road march. No enemy fire, no heroic last stands. Just heat, disease, and Japanese brutality. Calugas saw friends from Battery B collapse. He couldn't help them. Helping meant dying. He kept walking. The prisoners reached San Fernando, Pampanga on the 5th day. The Japanese loaded them into metal freight cars. 100 men per car, designed for 30. No ventilation, no water. The heat inside the cars was 120 degrees or higher. Men died standing up, their bodies held upright by the press of other prisoners. The train ride to Carpus took 4 hours. When the doors opened, dozens of corpses fell out of each car. The survivors stumbled onto the platform. Then they walked the final 8 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Calugas was still alive, but the real test was just beginning. Camp O'Donnell was a death camp in everything but name. The Japanese had built it to hold 10,000 prisoners. By mid-April 1942, it held 50,000. No sanitation. 1 water spigot for the entire camp. Prisoners stood in line for 12 hours to fill a canteen. Dysentery killed hundreds every day. The bodies were stacked outside the barracks until burial details could drag them to mass graves. Men who had survived the death march died within weeks at O'Donnell. Calugas arrived at the camp on April 14th. The guards searched prisoners at the gate. Took anything valuable, watches, rings, money. They beat prisoners randomly. No reason, just because they could. Calugas still had his malaria. The real symptoms mixed with his exaggerated performance kept the guards away. They shoved him toward the barracks and told him to find a space. He walked into a building designed for 200 men. 800 prisoners were crammed inside. No beds, no blankets, just wooden floors and the smell of death. The Japanese provided almost no food. Rice once a day, maybe a handful per prisoner, sometimes nothing. Men were dying at a rate of 30 to 50 per day. The guards didn't care. They considered prisoners subhuman, unworthy of decent treatment. The Geneva Convention meant nothing here. Camp O'Donnell operated by one rule: the strong might survive, the weak would definitely die. Calugas was determined to be in the first category. He noticed patterns. Guards beat prisoners who made eye contact, prisoners who walked too slowly, prisoners who walked too fast. The safe zone was middle speed, eyes down, no distinctive behaviour, invisible. He applied the same strategy from the death march. Blend in. Look sick, but not dying. Avoid attention. When burial details were called, he volunteered. The work was horrific, but it kept him moving. Movement meant circulation. Circulation fought disease better than lying still in the barracks. The months crawled by: May, June, July, August. The death rate at Camp O'Donnell was so high, the Japanese transferred some prisoners to other camps. Calugas stayed. His malaria came and went. Each time the fever spiked, he exaggerated it. Guards continued avoiding him. By September, he had survived 5 months. Many of the men who arrived with him were dead. The survivors were skeletal, malnourished, diseased, but alive. The Americans and Filipinos had formed networks, shared food, shared information, shared hope that liberation might come. In January 1943, a Filipino official from Pampanga province petitioned for Calugas's release. The Japanese sometimes released Filipino prisoners for agricultural work. They needed labourers for farms and mills. The official claimed Calugas was needed for rice production. The petition was approved. On January 15, 1943, exactly 1 year and 1 day after his Medal of Honor action, Calugas walked out of Camp O'Donnell. He had survived 9 months in hell, lost 40 pounds, suffered repeated beatings, watched thousands die, but he was alive and free. Sort of. The Japanese assigned him to a rice mill in Pampanga. The work was hard, 12-hour days, minimal food. But it was better than the camp. No random beatings, no mass death. Calugas operated milling equipment, processed rice for Japanese supply convoys. The overseers watched constantly. Any sign of sabotage meant execution. But they couldn't watch everything, and they definitely couldn't watch thoughts. Calugas began planning his next move. Filipino guerrilla units were operating throughout Luzon. Resistance fighters who had escaped the surrender. Former soldiers who melted into the jungle. Civilians who refused Japanese occupation. They raided supply convoys, ambushed patrols, gathered intelligence for MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. The guerrillas needed men with military experience. Calugas had 12 years in the Philippine Scouts. Artillery training, combat experience. He was exactly what they needed. But first he had to make contact without the Japanese discovering his plan. A resistance member approached him in March 1943. Quiet conversation near the mill. The guerrillas knew about Calugas, knew about his Medal of Honor, wanted him to join. But leaving immediately would be suspicious. The Japanese would hunt down escapees, execute anyone who helped them. Calugas needed to be patient. Gather information first, spy on Japanese operations at the mill, pass intelligence to the resistance, prove his value, then escape when the time was right. He agreed. By April, Sergeant Jose Calugas, Medal of Honor, recipient and prisoner of war survivor, had become a spy for the Philippine resistance. The Japanese had no idea the cook they had captured was about to become one of their most dangerous enemies. Calugas spent 6 months as a spy at the rice mill. He memorized Japanese patrol schedules, counted supply trucks that arrived each week, noted which roads were guarded and which were not. The information passed to resistance contacts who visited the mill disguised as farmers selling vegetables. The guerrillas used the intelligence to plan ambushes. They knew when convoys would be lightly guarded, when patrols would be away from their bases, when the Japanese were vulnerable. Calugas never saw the results of his information, but Japanese casualties in Pampanga province increased through the summer of 1943. By October, the resistance decided Calugas was more valuable in the jungle than at the mill. They had enough spies, they needed experienced soldiers. A guerrilla unit called Squadron 227, Old Bronco, was operating in Nueva Ecija province under Major Robert Lapham and Captain Harry Mackenzie. Both were American officers who had escaped the Bataan surrender. They commanded roughly 300 Filipino fighters, former soldiers, farmers, students, anyone willing to fight the Japanese occupation. The squadron needed an artillery specialist. Calugas fit perfectly. The escape was planned for October 23rd. Calugas would leave the mill during his lunch break, walk into the jungle, and never return. The resistance had prepared a route through areas without Japanese patrols. Local farmers would provide shelter and food along the way. By October 25th, he had reached the Old Bronco headquarters deep in the mountains of Nueva Ecija. Major Lapham interviewed him personally, verified his identity, confirmed his Medal of Honor citation, then promoted him to second lieutenant and gave him command of a weapons platoon. Calugas was back in the war, but this war was different from Bataan. No front lines, no artillery support, no supply chain. Guerrilla warfare meant hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage. The Japanese controlled the cities and major roads. The guerrillas controlled everything else. They moved at night, struck fast, disappeared before Japanese reinforcements arrived. The tactics were effective, but dangerous. Captured guerrillas were tortured and executed. Civilians suspected of helping guerrillas were massacred. The stakes were higher than conventional combat. The weapons platoon under Calugas specialized in raids on Japanese supply depots. They would scout a target for weeks, learn the guard patterns, identify weak points, then attack at the most vulnerable moment, steal weapons, ammunition, and food, destroy what they couldn't carry, vanish into the jungle before the garrison could respond. By early 1944, Calugas had led 17 successful raids, 0 casualties among his men. The Japanese put a price on his head. They didn't know he was the Medal of Honor recipient from Bataan. They just knew a guerrilla officer was causing serious problems in Nueva Ecija. In June 1944, Allied forces invaded Normandy in Europe. The war was turning against Japan on all fronts. MacArthur was pushing north through New Guinea toward the Philippines. The guerrillas intensified operations to prepare for his return. Squadron 2. 27 Old Bronco received orders to attack the Japanese garrison at Carangalan. The target was a fortified position with 200 enemy troops, machine gun nests, mortar pits, barbed wire. Taking it would require coordination between multiple guerrilla units. Calugas would lead the assault element. The attack came on August 7th, 1944. 3 guerrilla companies, 450 men total, surrounded the garrison at 0300 hours. Calugas's weapons platoon hit the main gate with concentrated rifle fire and grenades. The Japanese responded with machine guns and mortars. The firefight lasted 4 hours. Guerrillas used captured Japanese weapons. Ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. By 0700 hours, the garrison commander surrendered. The guerrillas had taken Carangalan with 23 casualties. The Japanese lost 117 killed and 83 captured. The victory was significant but temporary. Japanese reinforcements would retake Carangalan within days. The guerrillas couldn't hold fixed positions. They looted the garrison, took all weapons and supplies, released Filipino prisoners the Japanese had been holding, then burned the buildings and withdrew into the mountains. The pattern repeated throughout Luzon. Attack, win, withdraw. The guerrillas were preparing the islands for MacArthur's return, and in January 1945, he finally came back. American forces landed on Luzon on January 9th, 1945. The liberation had begun. Squadron 227, Old Bronco, intensified attacks to support the American advance. Calugas led raids on Japanese communication lines, destroyed bridges, ambushed retreating enemy units. The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was inevitable. The Japanese were being pushed back. By April, most of Luzon was under American control. The Philippine Scouts who had survived the war stepped forward, rejoined the United States Army. Calugas was among them. And finally, after 3 years, he would receive the medal he had earned on January 16th, 1942. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on April 30th, 1945, at Camp Olivas in Pampanga Province. Major General Richard Marshall, Chief of Staff to General MacArthur, conducted the presentation. Calugas stood in formation with other Philippine Scouts who had survived the war. He wore a new uniform, the first clean uniform he had worn in 3 years. The citation was read aloud. The action near Culis, Bataan Province, on January 16th, 1942. Running 1,000 yards under fire without orders. Organising volunteers. Operating the gun for 6 hours. Stopping the Japanese advance. General Marshall placed the Medal of Honor around Calugas's neck. The ribbon felt strange after everything he had been through. The Bataan Death March. 9 months at Camp O'Donnell. Spying at the rice mill. 2 years fighting with the guerrillas. The medal represented 1 day, 1 action. But that action had saved the defensive line. Given other units time to withdraw. Held the Japanese advance for 6 critical hours. The medal was earned, no question, but Calugas knew the truth. Thousands of Filipino and American soldiers had fought just as bravely. Most were dead. Many had no medals, no recognition, just unmarked graves scattered across Bataan and Luzon. After the ceremony, the army offered Calugas United States citizenship. He accepted immediately. Then they offered him a commission as a second lieutenant in the regular United States Army. He accepted that too. His service with the Philippine Scouts was over. The Scouts would be disbanded after the war ended, but Calugas would continue serving. He was assigned to the 44th Infantry Regiment for occupation duty in Okinawa. The war in the Pacific officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan signed the surrender documents aboard USS Missouri. Calugas remained in the army after the war. He served in Okinawa, then the Ryukyu Islands, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Back to the Philippines for the 10th anniversary of the Battle of Bataan in 1952, Fort Lewis, Washington in 1953 with the 2nd Infantry Division. He slowly brought his family from the Philippines to the United States. His wife, 4 children, all became American citizens. Calugas earned his high school equivalency diploma at age 47. Retired from the Army in 1957 with the rank of captain after 27 years of service. Civilian life was an adjustment. Calugas enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, studied business administration, graduated in 1962 at age 55. His son later said earning that degree was his father's most cherished achievement. After graduation, Calugas worked for Boeing Company until 1972. Then he farmed a small plot of land outside Tacoma, grew vegetables, raised chickens, lived quietly. The Medal of Honor recipient who had killed dozens of Japanese soldiers and survived the worst atrocities of the Pacific War spent his final decades in peace. Calugas organized the Bataan Corregidor Survivors Association, worked for 15 years helping other veterans connect, share stories, process trauma. Many survivors never talked about what they experienced. The death march was too painful, Camp O'Donnell too horrific, but the association gave them a place to speak if they wanted, or just be around others who understood. Calugas attended reunions, gave occasional interviews, but he never sought attention. His son remembered him saying, "The Medal of Honor belonged to all the men who died in the Philippines. He was just the one wearing it." Jose Calugas died on January 18, 1998, in Tacoma, Washington. He was 90 years old, survived by his wife and 4 children, buried at Mountain View Memorial Park. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the Fort Sill Museum in Oklahoma. A relief sculpture commemorating his action stands on Mount Samat in the Philippines at the National Memorial to the Battle of Bataan. The sculpture shows Calugas running across open ground toward the gun position, the moment a cook became a one-man army. The Japanese mocked soldiers wearing kitchen aprons, thought cooks were not real fighters. On January 16, 1942, Sergeant Jose Calugas proved them catastrophically wrong. One man, one gun, 1,000 yards under fire. He stopped an entire enemy column, saved the defensive line, earned the Medal of Honor, survived the death march, fought as a guerrilla, lived to see liberation, then spent 50 years as an American citizen and veteran advocate. His story deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about cooks who became one-man armies. Stories about Filipino Scouts who held the line when everything collapsed. Stories about men who survived death marches and came back to fight as guerrillas. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us if you have ever heard of Jose Calugas before today. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jose Calugas and the Philippine Scouts do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.